Assalamu alaikum. Let's see how we can deploy a Kubernetes cluster in Azure using AKS. Then we test that cluster by deploying a simple nginx app. So first of all, we will create and deploy the cluster, and then we will deploy an nginx pod using YAML file. So let's first of all create a resource group before creating the cluster. So az create, and we give it the name, which is my resource group, and the location, which will be in West Europe. So now to create the cluster, we use the command az aks create, and here we will give it three parameters: the name, the resource group, and the node count. So the node count here is the number of the worker node inside the cluster. So in a Kubernetes cluster, we have a master node and we have worker nodes. So the node count is the number of the worker node. For example, if we want to deploy a cluster with only one worker node, we give the node count 1. But if we want the cluster to have 3 worker node, we write 3 here. Okay, we give 3 to the worker node, to the node count. But I will deploy a cluster with only one worker node. For the name, I will call it my cluster. And for the resource group, I will give it my resource group. So let's deploy the cluster. So the cluster is successfully deployed in Azure. And now if we go to the Azure portal, we will find the cluster in the portal. So let's go to the resource group and let's click on my resource group. Here is my cluster. Now we can use this cluster by deploying in it any Kubernetes object like pods or replication controller, replica set, or deployment, or any Kubernetes object. But before that, let's clear the terminal and let's access the cluster. So to access the cluster, first of all, we run the command az aks get credentials. And here we give it the name of the cluster, which is my cluster, and the resource group, which is my resource group. Let's press enter. So here we give it yes. Now we can access the cluster and we can starting deploying any Kubernetes object inside the cluster. So now if we run the command kubectl get pods, here the output indicates that no resource found because we didn't deploy any pod inside the cluster. So let's create a new YAML file and deploy a simple nginx pod. So let's call it nginx pod.yaml. And here we will write the manifest file to deploy the pod. So let's start by the API version. API version, which is v1. For the kind, it will be a pod. And for the metadata, where we define the name and some labels. So let's, for the name, I will give it nginx pod. Let's give it also some labels, for example, app nginx. Okay, so now let's go to the spec section and write the configuration of the pod. So here we will specify the containers, and we will have only one container. So for the name, I will call it nginx container. Okay, and we will give it also the image used to create that container. For the image, I will give it nginx And we can give it also the pod and many other things, but that's enough to deploy the pod. So to deploy the pod using this YAML file, we run the command kubectl create -f nginx pod .yaml. So let's press enter. So the nginx pod is successfully created. Let's display the pod that we have again using kubectl get pods. Press enter. And here we have only one pod, which is the nginx pod. It is created 17 seconds ago. Okay, we can also display the IP address of the pod and many other information using the command kubectl get pods with wide option. Let's press enter. And here is the IP address of the pod, also the name of the worker node, and many other information. We can also get more information about the pod by running the kubectl describe pod, and here we give it the name of the pod, which is nginx pod. Let's press enter. So here it gives you a lot of information about the pod, like the name, the namespace, the node, and the labels, the containers, the IP address, and many information. Okay, so we have seen how to deploy the pod. So now let's see how we can delete the pod from the cluster. For that, we use the command kubectl delete pod, and we give it the name of the pod, which is nginx pod. Let's press enter. Here the output indicates that the nginx pod is deleted. So that's how we can deploy a simple Kubernetes cluster in Azure. And then we have seen also how we can deploy an nginx pod inside the cluster. So I hope that the demo was helpful. Thank you very much.